So I was thinking a good thing to start on with this is to find what we probably agree on as like the starting point. So something that I think that we probably both agree on is that it's better for a bunch of reasons that we can enumerate, but it's better for a bunch of reasons if more people that are interacting with blockchains are doing it via nodes, via full nodes in a trust minimized way. So like we want people to run nodes.
Absolutely. You want them to only be trusting the set of data off the longest chain.
Yeah, and I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. I mean, like one is from your own personal like security and best practices. Like it's better for you to not be trusting anybody else. But in terms of like the health of the whole network, like obviously if everybody is just always interacting with Infura or something like that, then that becomes like a honeypot or an easy target for someone that wants to censor the network or censor specific transactions or attack a specific user or just disrupt the whole thing, right? Like if Infura, like even right now today, if Infura shut down, it would be pretty disruptive to the functioning of the entire Ethereum ecosystem, right? So the more people run nodes for all those reasons, the better.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Cool. So then the question becomes like, what does it mean to run a node? And specifically like that. So the discussion that this came from on Twitter was specifically around the idea of whether a fast synced node in Ethereum and or a node synced in with Bitcoin Core that has assume valid set greater than 0, like whether that is a full node or not, like what does that mean? Whether that's trust minimized or not. And basically the way I was pushing the discussion was like, what are the specific trade-offs in terms of security and trust that you're making when you make those decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. There's trade-offs for everything. My argument in general is just that the trade-offs of not fully validating the state from 0 to chain tip, or at least from wherever there's a heavy amount of proof of work to chain tip, because a good point even on Bitcoin Core is that the Bitcoin Core daemon is that you can go from 2009 to 2013 and you can produce that entire chain with very little hardware nowadays, very small. But yeah, in general, you want to fully validate your chain just so that everything is in a line and all your ducks are in a row. Because otherwise you end up with some funky things that can happen. And I was using double spending as a example of that, but I don't actually think that double spending would be the thing that somebody would do if they ended up in a case where they're essentially one of a few groups of people sharing the entire state of the chain, because that's very obviously you're writing a bad check, very obviously bad, but they might do something like, have a sort of secret inflation that you can only verify that it's there or not if you actually validate the full state. And that's the type of thing that I'm thinking would probably be the more insidious outcome in the worst case scenario where nobody can fully validate the Ethereum chain. And I would say that today, even though it takes a while to full sync the chain, it's not beyond everybody to do, but it's adding a day's worth of syncing every month. So that's a definite concern as time goes on. Yeah,
so I think I think a lot of what you said is valid. So the first thing to say is that there's definitely, there is a trade-off, right? Like there is a security trade-off and trust trade-off that's required when you do a fast sync. So I definitely don't want to make it seem like my argument is that there's no trade-offs. I guess my question is are the trade-offs acceptable, and what are the risks that you're taking if you don't do that? And so what are your risks as an individual? And then what's the risk, more systemic risks for the whole network if a lot of people are fast syncing, right? So I think it's important to talk a little bit about how Ethereum works. So, Ethereum is account based. In other words, there's a global state, and that includes balances, but it also includes all the smart contract state. And so I'm going to make a lot. I'm going to say things in general here that aren't necessarily specifically exactly correct, but like on a deep technical level. But I think are directionally mental model wise. You can think of it this way. It's almost it's as if like you could think of this current state of the Ethereum network as a giant like a JSON blob, like with a bunch of fields and data filling out those fields for every address's balance, for every smart contracts properties and their states. So it's like this big blob of JSON, and what a full node does, or the way that Ethereum works in general, is each block contains basically a hash of that entire JSON state. Now, again, really oversimplifying, like under the hood, what's actually happening is it's like a Merkle tree, a specific type of Merkle tree called a Patricia tree, and so it's not having to actually hash multiple gigabytes of data every time it wants to calculate a block, because that would be prohibitively slow. It's only having to worry about adding those leaf nodes to the tree or whatever. But the point is, like, for all intents and purposes, you have a hash of the entire state. So when you fast sync a node on Ethereum, what you do is you download all the historical block data, you download the current state, and you check all the proof of work on the previous blocks is valid, and you hash the current state and check that the block, the latest block that you get, that state root is contained in that block. And then importantly, from that point on, you begin validating blocks. So as new blocks come in, it's not like you just assume each block moving forward is valid. You are validating each block that is handed to you from the network. So I think the big risk that you're at is while you're fast syncing, all the data that you get is fake or falsified in some way. So it's valid, but it's not the actual Ethereum chain. And the suggestion that I made in that Twitter thread is there's a pretty straightforward way to mitigate against that, which is to check your state root against the state root of some other trusted source. So here's where the trade-off is, right? There's some point in this process where you have to have some trust, right? And so, but if you, for example, like if you check with 3 different block explorers and you connect via Tor to check through those, use the Tor browser, and you also like text someone else who runs a full node and like ask them for their state root. Like if you've done those things, which aren't really prohibitively difficult, they're pretty straightforward, you can feel pretty confident that you haven't been lied to. And more than that, like if you then start to use the node, if you do some simple interactions with the network, if you send 0.1 ETH to somebody else, like, and they get it on their end and verify that they get it, again that you're connected and you're operating from that point trustlessly. So there's this point in time where you have to trust some entity to provide you with that state root. But once you've done that one-time verification, you are operating trustlessly, and that seems like a reasonable low-risk trade-off for, I would say, like 99% of users.
Yeah, so I don't actually think you're operating trustlessly in that scenario.
Okay.
The essential thing here is you touched on a lot there, but
yeah, I did. Sorry.
You're correct. Every block is essentially a big JSON file, and you can hash it out and make sure that it matches the leaf node of the Patricia tree. All the checksums match, and that's great. That's kind of similar to like when I go and download software. I don't do it all the time, but I'm supposed to SHA-256 summon and make sure the hashes line up.
Yep.
And then I need to go and actually check the signatures and make sure those are correct. And you can do that when in a system where what you're simply doing is transacting value. That works perfectly. Mm-hmm. But if you've ever, and I've done this myself, so I can speak from experience, if you've ever naively tried to set up an Ethereum block explorer and gone, you would immediately find that tons of balances that should be correct are just off. And the reason why is because you would need the archive node to actually store all the computations of various smart contracts, because smart contracts also shift value. So like when you're hashing your data and checking it against the tree, you're also hashing data that's going to actually execute in a way that you can't know until it executes itself. So yes, if the value property of a transaction was the only way that money moved across Ethereum, then what you're saying is actually like validating the full state would be very easy. That's kind of similar to Bitcoin, except Bitcoin has scripts, but a lot of the scripts are so simple that it might as well be that.
And they're stateless.
Yeah, and that's the problem, is that with that complexity, you end up in situations where you don't actually know somebody else's balance until you compute the state up until they got that balance. So if at like block 5 million, somebody tells you their balance is 100 ETH, if you had that happy path where the only thing, where from Genesis, everything was just simple value transfers until you got to that address, then yeah, you can pluck off that part of the tree and you're fine. But if it's not, and there's smart contracts in between, then you've got to go and you've got to validate everything in between until you get to a point where you're like, okay, this next leap has to be to there and can't possibly be anything else. And that's where you get the issue where you're tracing down much longer, heavier trees that you have to actually compute the state for. So even though you have the data, you don't actually know the resulting calculations of where money was moved then. And that's really like the thing where, if I say, in block 15 million, I've sent you 10 ETH, and you can go and check that block, but you don't know in between if from blocks 5 to 15 million, whether or not I've moved it elsewhere. And if I'm storing it in a smart contract, then you sure don't know where it's going to go until that final end result. And I could even give you a previous block with that contains a computation refers to block 5 million. So maybe at block 10 million, I show you a block and I say, this proves it. This block at 10 million is the one where it went to a regular account and the regular account sending to you, but then you still don't know in between there. So it becomes less trustless. And as the node grows too, like you say, you can check 3 different block explorers. You can text your friend, say, what's this block hash at this height? Yeah, you can do those things, but the problem is that, one, you still don't know the old state if it hasn't actually been verified, and 2, if the chain grows at these what I consider very large proportions right now and continues to, you may end up in a situation where you don't have 3 block explorers, where you literally have a couple server rooms that can actually do this. And if you're a new entrant and you want to trustlessly validate it, you might have 3 or 4 months before you can even get going. And nobody's going to do that. They're going to go and trust the 1 or 2 Infuras of the world that are left. And that's my fear for where this eventually leads to.
Yeah. So there was a lot in there. That was good. So let me try to unpack things sort of one by one, and feel free to interrupt if you want to interject at any point. So because otherwise I'll ramble on all day. But so the one thing that you said is that you can't be sure of a balance. Let me make sure I'm understanding it right. It sounds like you said, like, at a given block, even with the state root, you can't be sure of a balance because you don't know the history of how it got to that point.
Yeah, part of the history. The simple value transfers, but you don't know the smart contract executions that may have also led to it. So you might know potentially a minimum balance that they have, but you don't know if their maximum balance or their total balance.
Okay, so this is interesting because I know that you know your stuff, and so but I don't think that's exactly right, and I'll explain why I don't think it's right. We may not be able to resolve this, and it may just be the kind of thing where we, after this call, like, talk to I don't know, some people who are working on the node software itself or something to really know the difference. But let me try to explain why I don't think it's right, and then the first thing I'll say is that the one thing I definitely agree with, which is I know for sure is true, is that it's really hard to get from a regular Ethereum node. It's really hard to get any kind of history of how something like a balance or the state of a piece of smart contract got there, right? it's really hard to figure that history out. For that, you actually do need either a tracing node at a minimum or an archive node, both of which are extremely hard to sync and operate because of the space and the validation time and all that kind of thing. And I actually think that the fact that those historical states and the path that it took to get to those historical states, I think the fact that those are hard to get is actually a problem that Ethereum people should be more worried about and don't really talk a lot about. There's one person I know who's a friend of mine, Jay Rush. He has a company called True Blocks. It used to be called Quick Blocks. And he does talk about this a lot because he's written software that can run alongside your nodes that helps to mitigate that exact problem. It makes it easier to access these historical states in a trustless way. But at the default level, when you run a node, getting at those historical states is extremely difficult. And what he does is he has built a really, really optimized and very clever index, basically, that allows him to access those historical states and kind of monitor the chain and grow that index as it comes in. But that's an aside. So getting those historical states is very difficult. And that's a problem because like you said, it could be centralizing. There's only going to be a few block explorers that ever have that data. If you want to know things about your past balances, for tax compliance reasons, for auditing reasons, for any kind of reasons where you might want to know the history, those things are really hard to get, and we may be all depending on trusted third parties to get those, and that is problematic, right? So I completely agree with you there. What I'm not sure is correct is whether the fact that you don't know those histories makes it possible for someone to lie to you or to lie to your node or to allow us to create either a double spend or an invalid smart contract state mutation because of that. And here's why. Because of the way, so again, you think of it as this model of the hash of the hash of this JSON blob, and like a balance, for example, of an address or a contract or a smart contract state is basically an entry in that, right? So my address, it's a big string of characters, and it says, and it has a colon, and it says my balance is 1 ETH or 10 ETH or whatever, right? Sorry, go ahead.
The transaction, it's not exactly a balance, it's just the value transacted. So it's just a set of records of value transacted. Balance is something that's computed on the back end on your node once it gets the data, once it's validated. Well,
that's definitely true for Bitcoin nodes with the UTXO model, but that's where I'm not sure I agree. I don't think that's the case for how the Ethereum model works. I think the model, the mental model at least, more is like an entry in a ledger for a specific address, what the balance is.
Yeah, but you can tell the easy mutations, which are just literally there's a JSON transaction that says this value was transferred from A to B, but you can't tell the more complex mutations where they've gone through a smart contract to actually arrive at that. So you're getting the result. This is the result of this smart contract affecting the balance of this account. This is the result of this one affecting the balance of that, and so on. And you might end up with a very cyclomatically complex structure that you have to go through in order to find out the true balance of whatever this account is, and that's the major issue.
Interesting. So the way that I think of it is you have a state, right? And so Ethereum is kind of like a giant state machine. So you have a state like a balance, and you submit a transaction, and unlike on Bitcoin, that transaction isn't like an atomic update to the state in and of itself. Instead, it kicks off some code, and that code executes. And when it finishes executing, there's a new state. And so the next block has an updated entry in the ledger. The state went from this to this, right? And in order to validate that was correct, you have to actually execute all the code. And like you said, it can be very complex. And to know that, but because of the way a Patricia tree works, and because you have that hash of the state root, and because you've checked that with some party that you trust, and of course that does introduce this one-time trust that you need. But if you've done that, then you know that this initial state that you're starting from, so you fast sync up to block 5 million or 7 million or whatever, you get some state of the tree. You check that that root, so you're confident in it, now you know that that state is valid, or you have a high confidence that it's valid, unless the block explorer that you checked, or the friend that you asked, or the multiple block explorers that you checked have also been compromised and everyone is lying too, right? And so once you know that state, you begin validating from that point on. So mutations, like via these complex smart contract interactions, from that point on, you're validating that those things work. And because you know that initial state is correct, so it says my balance is 10. I have no clue how my balance got to 10. It's really hard to do that. That's where you need the archive node plus the tracing node. And even then it's difficult. The node's way too slow at getting the data out, right? So I don't know how it got to 10, but because of the properties of cryptography, because of the way Patricia trees work, and because I have this one-time trusted validation of the state root somewhere else, I can still trust that that state is the global network state. And so any mutation that starts from that state and runs smart contract code and produces a new state is valid. And any mutation that proposes a state that doesn't line up with what I have in that initial network state that I have, that I trust, is invalid, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, but that's really only for the data, the results. It's not for the transitions to get to that result. And what I'm kind of saying is that one third party or a couple third parties can all eventually, collude in order to produce a result that is actually invalid, actually doesn't follow the rules of the network. And the only way you know that is by actually validating it yourself.
So that's at the moment you're fast syncing, right? So like if they lie to me as I'm fast syncing and I get invalid data, and then the sources that I check the state root against are also lying.
In the final outcome of this, these are all the same sources. Fast syncing is almost doesn't even matter, because you're essentially just querying RPC APIs and asking for, several blocks of the stuff that you're interested in, and you're kind of looks correct. Everything hashes out right, but at the same time, it didn't follow the rules of the network, and that's the thing you need the node for. You don't need the node really to make sure that you're on the heaviest chain or the correct chain. You can visually see there's enough fucking zeros here in the hash. This is the right chain, but you don't actually know if they follow the rules. And that's the thing. I don't even think that they're going to double spend or that type of thing. I think well-meaning people will say, well, Ethereum is great and we need to keep mining this because we're still doing ETH1.x. But the problem is that the inflation rate is too low. Fees aren't keeping up. We're not making enough subsidy. So we're going to issue ourselves some Ethereum. It's fine. We'll vote on it amongst ourselves. It's so low that whatever. And you're not going to be able to know that they're doing that because you don't validate the full state and see that these blocks haven't been following the emission schedule. There's some random account somewhere that says it sent money here. There's other blocks that claim that account had money and it didn't, but you won't know that until you actually validate the state yourself. So if they perform that attack at the time that I am fast syncing, right, and if they're able to compromise wherever I choose to validate the state tree somewhere else, then yes, they could trick me. But if I fast sync a node today and then operate it from that point on, just like any other node, I'm validating every block and every transition. So if at that point some consortium of people tried to conspire to change the state of the network, my node would know, and it would reject any kind of state transition that was invalid. And again, the longer you operate a node that was fast synced and interact with the ecosystem, and that node works, the greater confidence you can have
even beyond just your single check of the state tree, the greater confidence that you can have that you are following the chain and that you're following consensus rules. And this is an important point. Like something that I think isn't totally understood is that
you have, whatever, no matter how long you run the node, as long as you're validating the state, you always have full confidence that you're on the correct network, assuming that you haven't been completely eclipsed by,
Right. But an eclipse attack is possible on Bitcoin with full validation or not. And that's
possible on anything. No, I agree with you.
And so, and that's not really impacted by whether you fast sync or not. And so this is like an important point that I think is maybe misunderstood. Like an Ethereum fast sync node looks, once it's done syncing, looks exactly the same as a regular Ethereum node that does full validation while it syncs, right? And they behave exactly the same, right? Like a regular full node, if you don't run it in tracing and/or archive mode, prunes those states the same after it validates them, the same way that a fast sync node prunes the state. So, like Eric on Twitter, who sparked this conversation, who's doing this experiment where it's taking him now, probably it's going to take him about a month to fully validate the node on his MacBook. His node, when he's done, is going to look exactly the same as my node on my MacBook, which I initially fast synced. And if we compared those two, like there's nothing that says that his did full validation and mine didn't. It's just a matter of the trust trade-off that I made versus him in getting a node to that state, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so essentially, Eric knows that his node is 100% valid. You don't know if your node's 100% valid. You can compare the bits and then trust Eric when he says that his node is 100% valid.
Well, I guess I kind of subtly disagree with that. I know that my node is 100% valid because my state root lines up and because I've been using it to transact on the Ethereum network for a long time. And so once I know that, moving forward, I have full confidence that my node is valid. So unless someone managed to attack me in that moment and I didn't realize it and I proceeded to operate my node not knowing that I had been attacked, once I gain enough confidence that hasn't happened, my node is essentially as trustless and trust minimized as Eric's. There's no difference between our two trust models at that point.
I mean, it's transacting successfully on the network, but you don't know the full. You don't know that the full network is valid and that the rules of the network have been followed up until that point. You could even be somebody else could be secretly inflating the supply, but because it's so hard to sync, that's the core of the issue. I think is that yes, if you start syncing today. And even if you fast synced an Ethereum node, I've fast synced Ethereum nodes before. I've synced Bitcoin D with assumed valid. I've also done it without assumed valid. Mm-hmm. For the most part, right now, they are all going to work out the same. But the issue becomes, 5 years from now, when it takes 3 months, 4 months to sync your node, and somebody new wants to validate everything, they're not going to be able to, or they're going to have quite a bit of difficulty. You're just going to continue to lose nodes that have copies of the blockchain, have fully validated it, and can raise these red flags. Because if not, then these types of attacks on the network do exist, where whoever is left validating it can make up all their own rules, and as long as they structure the data so that it looks right to you, there's not much to do. Like, I get what you're saying, and I understand that in a very kind of practical way today, it doesn't matter that much, but it's going to start mattering quite a lot more. And it even matters today if somebody wants to sync 2 weeks worth of or a month worth of data, however long it takes. That's not good. You've got to make sure that people are also following the rules on top of following the chain. And even if it doesn't affect you and your spending, people could not be following the rules elsewhere. They can be issuing their own money without you knowing. And you'll find out one day when you get a transaction that makes no sense and rejects it and goes, what the hell is this?
Yeah, and so I think
Yeah.
you're right. I think this is the crux of the issue, and at the end of the day, it is like a technical point that we should probably talk to someone who could talk to a bunch of people who would be able to help us settle it. Because I don't think that that's right, but I'm totally willing to admit that I'm wrong. I'm not like, I don't work on, I've never source dived in any of, in Parity or Geth or any of the node software. But again, I think because of the way, like I understand the intuition that if you don't validate everything yourself, how can you know that it's correct, right? And so I think the answer is that there's a counterintuitive property that emerges because of the way, because of the guarantees that cryptography gives you. And this happens all the time in cryptography. There's lots of counterintuitive things that emerge from this field, right, that our brains can't really understand, or it's not easy for us to understand or to grok. But when you check the math, so to speak, it actually works out. And I think this is one of those things. I think that because of the way the Patricia tree works, and because of the way that state is represented globally on the network in the Patricia tree, that once I validate that state root out of band, and if you make the assumption that validation is successful, that from that point on, no one can lie to me. No one can. I can't find out 5 years from now that I had some bad state and this transaction is not valid or something like that, because I know with confidence that state is correct. And again, I'm willing to be corrected on this point, but I think I have the right understanding of it. And this is a difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum. So it is it's understandable why folks get confused about it. And again, maybe I'm confused. I'm completely open to that.
Yeah, I mean, I probably have a deeper understanding of the workings of Ethereum than I do Bitcoin. I'm actually working on changing that.
Yeah.
As far as like the actual like practical use of the network. But yeah, I mean, I can always be wrong. But the thing is, like, you just don't know when you follow the Patricia tree, you know what the data hashes out to, but you don't know what the result of the computation was, and that's the problem. That's the thing that requires some level of trust. If you don't want to actually do the computation yourself, then you have to say, I have to trust these people that are telling me, what the result of that computation was. I mean, even in I'd hate to bring up the DAO, but the DAO, there was a soft fork proposal where they basically said, we could just make a soft fork temporarily, freeze those funds by essentially saying that we're not going to allow any transactions without money to move from this account to another account. But then the issue was you could denial of service a node because you can make a bunch of invalid transactions, broadcast them to the node, and they're going to have to compute them first, and then find out that, oh no, this spends from the wrong place that we're not supposed to allow,
right?
And we need to drop that. And that's the same type of thing that can happen here, where you eventually can't know the state without trusting somebody. And you need to compute it. I don't actually think so. Like account-based and UTXO-based, there are differences, but the major difference actually seems to be how people use them. Like an account-based system, if in and of every single transaction I was sending money, say, to you, and I sent money to you, and then I made a new address for myself that was the full change output, and I spent the entire, account there. That's the same as a UTXO model. It's just Bitcoin has that design more in the core of it, where you're really not supposed to reuse them, but you can reuse wallet addresses, whatever you want to call them, on. I heard invoice IDs recently, which I like, on Bitcoin, and yeah, so I don't think there's that much validation difference when you're talking about like the very basics of it. Bitcoin and Ethereum work in a lot of the same ways there, where for just value transfers, Bitcoin is checking a simple script that doesn't take much processing power, and Ethereum is checking these value transfers that don't take much processing power. And those parts are fine. The parts that require the full validation are the more complex things, where on the Ethereum side, you have to fully validate because you don't know the result of this computation. This computation could spend money, it could not, and we've got to validate each and every one in between, from when somebody sent it to when I received it, and how they got there. And Bitcoin, the same thing. You can't just trust that this script. You have to still execute it in order to fully validate the state. My main concern with that's the thing. Like, I wish that on the Ethereum side, people would take this more conservative approach to making sure that these things are fully validated, because otherwise you end up in a situation where you have kind of your what was that thing? You have your knowns, your unknowns, your known unknowns, and your known knowns, and whatever.
Unknown unknowns, yeah.
Yeah, your attack surface inherently becomes larger. And it boggles my mind too, because like the only thing that you need to do to make Ethereum scale for the time being, and I mean scaling in the term that everybody can participate in the same equal capacity.
Sustainability,
is just reduce the gas limit. Like I don't get it. Like I fully believe when the gas maintainers are saying things like, we're optimizing the EVM, we're optimizing the backends, we're going to make this go faster. Like, that's great. Okay, do that, but like just lower the gas limit in the meantime, because 8 million gas is kind of nuts. It even adds more. It actually adds more data, like computationally, per 10 minutes than Bitcoin. At least prior to SegWit, it was adding 1.5 megabytes of just data per 10 minutes to the blockchain, whereas Bitcoin was adding 1 megabyte, and now it can add up to like 1.8-ish.
Yep.
But yeah, it's very like I don't get it.
Yeah. So we've transitioned into a slightly different topic, and that's good. I think we can talk about that for a minute before we wrap up. I think that is an interesting discussion in terms of the trade-offs between the two networks. And I'm very outspoken on Twitter and elsewhere about the idea that I like Bitcoin and Ethereum a lot, and some other projects in the space, but especially those two I see as the most important and mature and useful projects in the ecosystem. And so what I think, so I don't have a very strong opinion on like specifics about the gas limit. And you might be right that it would be prudent for it to be lower than it is today. I can't say that I'm close enough to the ground and understand all the trade-offs well enough to know where to turn that dial exactly. What I can say is, at a high perspective, is that I don't think it makes sense for Ethereum to just try to be Bitcoin, right? Like, we have Bitcoin, we don't need Ethereum to be Bitcoin. So if Ethereum isn't going to do something different, make a different set of trade-offs, then there's really no reason for Ethereum to exist. And so I think personally that the set of trade-offs at a high level, again, not down in the weeds in terms of like specific gas limits or anything like that, not that those things don't matter, but at a high level, I think that Ethereum has made a good set of trade-offs when compared to Bitcoin. And there are trade-offs again. And I think that Bitcoin's trade-offs are totally rational, right? Like, it makes, I'm going to personify Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin doesn't have a consciousness, but it makes total sense for Bitcoin to focus on being the most secure, the soundest, the most censorship resistant, and to really double down on all of those properties. And so preventing the blockchain from growing at a pace that might prevent people from running nodes, and to maximize the ease at which people can run nodes and validate the chain themselves and all those things. That's a total valid set of trade-offs and goals. And I don't think it would make sense for Ethereum to optimize for those exact same set of trade-offs. So obviously Ethereum has a lot more functionality in terms of smart contract capabilities. As you rightly said, that increases the attack surface of Ethereum. It makes it more.
That's not what increases the attack surface, in my opinion. But yeah,
what's that? Sorry,
I don't think that's what increases the attack surface. It's making certain assumptions about validation are what increase attack surface.
Okay.
But yeah, I agree that. Yes.
I mean, just in general, I think there's more complexity in the implementation of a fully, a full stateful smart contract platform. So attack surface, at least in the sense of there could be bugs lurking somewhere or vulnerabilities. Also, I think that there's like an underexplored question about like systemic issues and between smart contracts that store a lot of value and security of the whole chain around those things, right? So like there's this game theoretic thing where if like attacking the chain or doing some kind of selfish mining attack became valuable enough because of your ability to manipulate some inputs or some outcome in a smart contract, then you might be strongly incentivized to do that. And we're starting to see smart contracts emerge that are important enough and valuable enough that those incentives might exist. And so like that game theory is all going to be explored over the years. And it may turn out that there are major issues with the trade-offs that Ethereum made in those respects that we haven't understood yet, and that causes an issue. And so but I think it's worth Ethereum making those trade-offs and experimenting and trying to allow us to do more and learn more to take on those risks. And I think it makes sense for Bitcoin not to take those risks because it's not trying to be that. And so in other words, I think they're both making valid trade-offs. I think that the trade-offs that they're making actually complement each other well. I think it's good that both projects exist, and I think it's good that both projects have slightly different sets of values around those things. Yeah, I don't know. So that would be my kind of summary at a very high level.
Yeah, and I mean, for the most part, I agree. There's going to be different trade-offs. Obviously, if you have a certain complete execution layer to your blockchain, then yeah, that's a trade-off. But I think there's certain fundamental trade-offs that aren't worth making. Like not all trade-offs are made equal.
Yeah.
And there's some trade-offs that I think just trading off the ability for somebody to independently fully validate the chain is just not a trade-off worth making in any case. If you're trying to go for this thing that has a lot of value, that is essentially trying to create you're trying to create a better representation of reality in kind of, more philosophical way, is that like you want a version of a source of truth that nobody can manipulate. And you don't want to make any trade-offs that can manipulate that particular guarantee. To me, that's a guarantee that's like kind of intrinsic to all blockchains that are trying to be this type of thing. And that to me is just a trade-off that's not worth making.
Yeah, that's fair. And that goes back a little bit to the discussion that we were already having around how big is the risk if you don't fully validate and you fast sync. And that comes back to this kind of open technical question that we have around that level of risk and how the state tree is represented and what the opportunity is for someone to attack you there. So we have to table that particular thing. But yeah, I think we agree that that there's a set of there's different sets of trade-offs, and there are definitely some trade-offs that aren't working, or that aren't worth making. I mean, I could point to other projects in this space. I won't call anyone out in particular, but you know them, and you know that they've made trade-offs toward centralization for the sake of things like scaling or performance that just make no sense, in my opinion. I mean, maybe I'll be wrong, but I don't think so, right? And so like, some of these projects are like definitely going to fail. The trade-offs that they've made are wrong, and and maybe Ethereum will end up in that camp too. I don't think so from where I'm sitting right now. I think that the sets of trade-offs they've made are reasonable. But like I said, it's still so early, and there's still a lot to be discovered and uncovered. But I'm glad that both projects exist and are exploring the space, the trade-off space.
Yeah, I'm happy that both projects are trying different things. I think I have my variety of concerns, but yeah, in general, it's a net good to have more projects. I think that a lot of Ethereum ideology, particularly when everything is on the table, and we're probably getting too off topic now, is actually a threat to the Bitcoin ideology, where you set these rules and then you don't change them. You play the game out until the end, because the full failure of the system is actually a preferable outcome than to the system becoming corrupted and becoming trusted by a large group of people again, like the other system that we've had. Yep. And so when people say, what if you need to inflate the monetary supply? What if you have to increase the block size at some point? It's kind of like, well, then, let it fail. Take it out back and shoot it and start again with a new system that can start a clean slate. Like, that's one of the core things that I think Ethereum, or the idea of exploring blockchains that can do more, is very interesting. But I think that there is definitely an importance to not putting everything on the table, and to just setting up an ideology and kind of sticking to it, rather than having one that is very flexible, like we'll adapt as we go along. It's just not the same type of thing. And yeah.
That's interesting. This is a little off topic, but it might be worth exploring for a minute or two here before we wrap up. I think that like capture is definitely a risk, and it's definitely more of a risk for Ethereum than it is for Bitcoin. But another way to think of it, and someone posted this on Twitter recently, and I'm unfortunately not going to remember who he or she was, so I can't give them credit. But another way to think of it is that Bitcoin is safer in a sense because it's already been captured. It already has a social, there's already a group, a social contract that's been put in place, and it is this conservative. Nothing is going to change. We're not going to hard fork or soft fork. Like you said, we'll fail before we do that. And
because it doesn't change rules.
Sorry, we're not going to hard fork. We'll only soft fork. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. And so Ethereum hasn't reached that point yet. I think it has to for it to be successful, right? Like, I think it can't change forever. So is like, it's a question of where you draw the line. And I think that Vitalik himself has said, like, eventually base layers have to ossify. And if they don't, and so the trade-off that Ethereum has made is they've said, like, we're not done yet. We're going to make changes, and at some point, this has to ossify. I think already Ethereum.
Software done.
Well, software itself is never done, right? But the network rules and everything do eventually have to be done. And look, it's possible that you're right here. Like, it's possible that this will cause major problems for Ethereum. I do think that things are generally trending in the right direction. Like, I think that Ethereum is more ossified as a community than it was previously. I think, like, for example, the parity multi-sig fiasco is an example of that, right? Like, there were a lot of big stakeholders who had a lot of money on the line to hard fork an invalid state mutation. And this wasn't even a thing where it wasn't clear, like, who should get the money. Like, it's all there, it's locked, it's completely known whose it is, and it's known that the intention of the contracts was not to lock it in this way. And yet the community pretty strongly rejected the idea of a state mutation to recover those funds. That said, like, it's definitely more subject to change than Bitcoin is, and that is another trade-off that they've made, that they're going to enable this change to continue for some period of time. Theoretically, the migration to ETH2, we'll see. That's a whole other topic that we probably shouldn't get into right now. But regardless, it's just a different set of trade-offs.
Yeah, I agree. I think the interesting thing about stopping the parity thing, even though it was a lot simpler to refund, both on a social layer and a technical layer, whatever, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But on a social layer, it was very much simpler. But I think the thing there is that, you can look to that and say that what the DAO fork slippery slope has been disproven because we didn't refund this. But the more that I've been in the space, the more I've come to understand that the DAO fork slippery slope isn't that what we're going to refund and what we're not going to refund. It's what we can change about the network and what we can't change about the network. It
Mhm.
went from you really aren't allowed to change anything about the network to, well, if you can ignore private keys, you can ignore pretty much anything, any rule about the network. And that's the type of thing that like worries me about Ethereum. And yeah, really, like I have no problem with Ethereum, the tech, or really Ethereum, the blockchain. It's Ethereum, the ideology around it is just nihilist. Nothing matters. Nothing's important. Anything's subject to change. And I know that's actually not a lot of the ideology of like you, for example, and for a lot of other people that I know in Ethereum. A lot of other people I know in Ethereum are actually fairly conservative and wanted the DAO to just be this one-time thing. But it seeps in and it slowly just destroys it. Like you need that core tenet of ideological thinking before you can have this rather political thing built on top of it. And that took me a long time to even understand because I was first in crypto for the money, then for the tech, and now for the politics and philosophy, I would say.
Interesting. Cool. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing there that I'm going to like strongly disagree with too much. I think it's just a matter of, it's a matter of differences, and those it's not clear right now what the right set of ideologies or trade-offs is, and the future's gonna play out.
I know.
It's complicated, and it is. So we'll see. Anyway, this I think was a pretty good chat. Anything that you wanted to add before we wrapped up?
No, that's about it. If you're watching this video and you want to invest in my startup, then ping me on Twitter or something. But have some meetings next month, so looking forward to those. So yeah, nothing else.
If we are going to post this, why don't you want to close with like where people can find you and hear more of your thinking?
Yeah, sure. My name's Anthony Lusardi. You can mostly find me on Twitter. My handle is Pyskell, Pyskell. It's a portmanteau of Python and Haskell. One language I can actually write well in. The other language I can write test code in. So I tried like 3 times. And yeah, that's basically it. I post a lot of non-serious stuff on Twitter a lot of the times. And I post a lot of jokes that I hope have some deeper meaning, but yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'm on Twitter too. It's just my name @BenDiFrancesco, and I also write a weekly newsletter that kind of takes a technical perspective on things that are going on in the blockchain world, and you can sign up for that at newsletter.buildblockchain.tech. So appreciate the conversation. Always appreciate the back and forth on Twitter, and I'll see you there.
Yeah, awesome. I'll talk to you later on Twitter, I guess.
Thanks, man. Good chatting.
Bye.